Good evening, my name's Yvonne Sherwood and I teach Biblical Studies and Jewish Studies at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. My co-panellists this evening on the far left are John Caputo, David R. Cook Professor of Philosophy at Villanova University, and just on my left here, Kevin Hart, Professor of English Literature at, and I'm told to say not Notre Dame, but Notre Dame, or something along those lines. John Caputo will be known to many of us as the author and editor of, among many other things, Against Ethics, Deconstruction in a Nutshell, The Prayers and Tears of Jacques Derrida, On Religion, God, the Gift and Postmodernism, and The Religious. Kevin Hart does interdisciplinary overtime as a theologian, a literary critic and a poet in his own right. He's the author of The Trespass of the Sign and The Dark Gaze, Maurice Blanchot and Friends, as well as books on Samuel Johnson, A.D. Hope, and collections of his own poetry, including Dark Angel and Flame Tree. It's my very great pleasure to introduce, in French, one would say, vous présenter, Jacques Derrida, who we're so very pleased to say is here, present with us, right before our very eyes and ears. There are numerous ways that I could introduce this man who, as an academic signature, needs no introduction, but who, because of the persistence of certain caricatures that still stand in for reading, perhaps in some sense still does. I could present him, as it's customary to do on these occasions, in terms of his curriculum vitae. But then his work, as he once said of Emmanuel Levinas, is now so large that one can no longer glimpse its edges. I could introduce him, as is also conventional, in terms of his institutional affiliations, past and present, for example at Yale, the Sorbonne, the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, the University of California at Irvine, and so on. But I wouldn't want to give you an impression of someone too much in love with institutions, who hasn't asked searching questions about the university and what the university means and does. Perhaps I could introduce him, as he sometimes has himself in a slightly tongue-in-cheek ecce homo, as a little Arab Jew, a Marano of French Catholic culture, who grew up in a Christianized Judaism that spoke of circumcision as baptism and bar mitzvah as communion, or as someone who regularly watches those Sunday morning TV programs on religion. These things certainly wouldn't be irrelevant to our context here at the American Academy of Religion and the Society of Biblical Literature. Perhaps the best way to introduce him in this context, without appropriating him for it, is to simply reel off a litany of topics that reverberate in his work as regularly as they reverberate around the discussions at our annual meetings. For example, Augustine, confession, circumcision, Paul, prayer, the Spirit and the Letter, the Talmud, the Talit, the touch of Jesus, the flood, the Tower of Babel, the sacrifice of Isaac and or Ishmael, Kierkegaard, Messianism, wars of interpretation, Jerusalem, Kabbalah, religious violence, the limits of ecumenism and tolerance, sacrifice, the sacrifice of woman at the heart of sacrifice, ethics, responsibility and forgiveness, the eschaton, the apocalypse of John, the name of God. Perhaps I should just say, just once more, for the record, that Derrida is not an enemy of the good old Aufklärung, not an inventor of a machine or school called deconstruction or deconstructionism, not someone who believes that all the world's a text and we are merely players. Indeed, as Derrida has said, one of the requirements of deconstruction is that it touch on firm structures and physical institutions, that it make text answer precisely to what matters to us. A while ago, some of us got together to set an empty chair for Jacques Derrida at the annual meeting, because we wanted to acknowledge the debt that many of us here owe to his work, and because we wanted to create an opening for something yet to come. We are so very glad that Jacques Derrida is here, that he's graciously agreed to speak in English, a language which is not his, and we would like to say, first of all, welcome.
Jacques, I would like to start, maybe the best place to start would be to talk about prayer. And in circumfession, you say that you're a man of prayers and tears, and that you pray all the time. And in the remark that you make that you direct to Jeffrey Bennington, you say, "I wonder if I ought to tell them that I pray, and describe how that could happen, according to what idiom and what rate, on one's knees or standing up, in front of whom or what books. For if you knew, G, my experience of prayers, you would know everything." Now, what do you mean by that? To whom are you praying, and how would your prayers be answered if, as you say elsewhere in that text, you rightly pass for an atheist? Who do you expect to answer the prayers?
In the sentence that you quote, the signatory of this text says, "Jay, if you knew my experience of prayers, you would know everything." So I understand you want to know everything. First, before I start trying to answer Jack's question, I would like to begin with a prayer, in fact. Mercy. I wanted to thank you, to all of you, for this extraordinary hospitality. To thank Yvonne, first of all. Your hospitality here is absolutely formidable, which means it's terrible for me. Because on the one hand, as Yvonne emphasized, I'm improvising here in a foreign language, facing questions and problems in which everyone knows I'm not competent. And so I feel really, I'm very anxious, and this is not a fiction. I'm very anxious, and I'll try to do my best. The first time this invitation was extended to me was in Paris, where I met Yvonne. And at the time, it was a conference on, how would I call it, on Judaism or Jewishness, or my relation to Judaïté, as we say in French. Jewishness, in the plural, Jewishnesses, if I can translate the title of this conference. And I was already anxious. It was in a building belonging to the Jewish community in Paris. And I was terrified, because on the one hand, I knew that some of these people at least would try and denounce me for not being Jewish enough or authentically Jewish. Others would try to convert me to Judaism. And so it was a very strange moment. When I said yes to Yvonne, I'll try. I was not expecting such an event. So, because I was not presenting myself in Paris as an authentic Jew, nor as a non-Jew. I'm not an expert in Judaism. And here I'm not a Christian either, not a Muslim, not a Buddhist. I'm not a biblical scholar. I'm not a theologian. And I have to face the terrible questions which come from, first of all, very, very generous friends who surround me, but who are experts in these fields. So please forgive me, and that's my first prayer. I beg your pardon for what I'll try to, in a very shy way, to say in front of you and in front of my friends. Now I'll try to answer Jack's question. My first answer would be take the form of a question. To whom does one ask publicly to say something about prayer, about the way he prays, before whom, and so on and so forth? If I were a priest or a theologian or a well-known believer, Jack wouldn't ask me such a question. If I were simply a non-believer, well-known as an atheist or as someone who is totally foreign to prayer, he wouldn't ask me this question. So why am I asked this question? Publicly. Some years ago, I would decline. I would say, no, I won't answer this question. And I'm wondering why I'm ready to say something. Before saying something in a very ingenuous, very, very naive and disarmed fashion, I would like to raise another question. In the text that you know better than others, and even better than me, in the text that you quote, you assume that I am the man who signed this text. The man who says, if I ought to tell them that I pray, and so on. But you know that the status of this text remains suspended. I'm not simply signing this text. This text has a structure. It's just a confession. It's a circumfession. So it's a text which turns around a possible, impossible confession. Not only around circumcision, but around confession. So I'm not confessing. I'm not signing a confession. I'm not speaking in my own name, on the one hand. And on the other hand, this text is intertwined with quotes from St. Augustine. It's a very complex structure in which it's difficult even for me to decide who is saying something about his prayer, his way of praying, and so on and so forth. So if I now answer your question, it would have nothing to do with the quote, because the quote is that if we had time, we would devote a long seminar on the status of this text, which is not theological, not a confession, not a letter, not. Then I'll try to say something. Nevertheless, although, as you know, a prayer is something, at least for me, to the extent that I pray, if I pray, secret. It's absolutely secret. That is, of course, there are public prayers. There are people who in communities pray together. And the first thing I would tell you is that when I was young, my first rebellion against my own religious environment had to do with public prayer. Common, prayers in common. So my way of praying, if I pray, is absolutely secret. Even if I'm in a public, even if in a synagogue I was praying with others, I knew that my own prayer would be silent and secret and interrupting something in the community. So that's one more reason for not answering your question. Nevertheless, I'll say something. A prayer, on the one hand, has to be, the way I understand it, a mixture of something absolutely singular and secret, that is idiomatic, untranslatable, and at the same time, a ritual that is involving the body in coded gestures, in common language, in intelligible language. So there's this mixture between a secret and sacred idiom and some common ritual in which the body accepts to make coded gestures. That's the way, if I pray, that I pray. That is something absolutely idiomatic and something which looks like what many people in many cultures, many religions do. Sometimes kneeling, sometimes with a book, sometimes without a book or kneeling, sometimes walking, sometimes. I pray all the time. I pray all the time, even now. But we have a problem. I have to address each question for 10 minutes, okay, so, because there are a number of questions coming. I would say, second, that my way of praying, if there is such a thing, if I pray, has more than one age. In the same instant, there is something very childish. And when one prays, one is always a child. Something childish, something archaic, gathering some memories of my childhood, and the images, the imagery, the iconography of God as a grandfather, a severe, just grandfather with a beard. And at the same time, a mother who thinks I am innocent, that is ready to forgive me. Okay? So there are these naive image of a couple of a terribly just but in merciless father, but just, understanding father, and a mother who is trying to trust my innocence. This is the layer of the childish layer of my prayers. The ones I perform once a day, for instance, before going to bed, or I pray a little time right now. Now there is also mixed with this on this layer, there's another layer, of course, which involves my culture, my philosophical, very critical experience, my experience of apophasis, my experience of a critique of religion, going through Feuerbach to Nietzsche to all of these things, the experience of a non-believer, someone who is constantly suspicious of the child, okay? And who resists, and who says, well, whom am I praying? Whom am I addressing? Who is God, and so on and so forth. And in this layer of sophistication, if I may call this way, I find a way of, let's say, meditating about who is praying and the who is receiving the prayer, the who my address. And I know that this very apparently negative. It's not negative, it's just a way of thinking. I think. When I pray, I think. I try to think. And this thinking prayer is not simply negative. It's a way of asking all the questions that we are asking here in this conference. A lot of them, of course. I cannot summarize these questions in 2 minutes now. But these questions are part of my experience of prayer. When I pray, I'm just thinking about negative theology, about the unnameable, the possibility for me to be totally deceived by my belief and so on and so forth. It's a very skeptical, I don't like this word, but this can be interpreted as a very skeptical prayer. Very skeptical. And this skepticism is part of the prayer. Instead of skepticism, I would call the epoke, the suspension of belief, the suspension of certainty, not of belief. The suspension of certainty is part of the prayer. And then I consider that this suspension of the certainty, this suspension of knowledge, this an ability to answer your question, to whom? Who do you expect to answer these prayers? Is part of what a prayer has to be in order to be authentic. If I were simply expecting an answer, that would be the end of a prayer. That would be an order, the way I order a pizza. Okay? No, I'm not expecting, and my assumption is that I must give up any expectation, any certainty as to the one or more than one to whom I address this prayer, if this is still a prayer. And of course, the child is praying for, expecting some answer or expecting some protection for himself, for life, for his beloved ones, for his relatives, for wives, children, friends, and so on and so forth. But I can't tell if I'm praying someone invisible, transcendent one, or if I'm praying precisely these other ones in myself that I want to address out of love and for the protection of their lives. Now, I'm already too long. Okay. Now, there is at the same time some suspension of any expectation, of any economy, any calculation. I'm not expecting, I'm not hoping. It's a hopeless prayer, on the one hand. Totally hopeless. And I think this hopelessness is part of what a prayer should be. And on the other hand, I know there is hope, there is calculation, there is economy. But what sort of economy? Is it the economy of the child or my own economy as an old man? By the way, if I accept to answer to some extent Jack's question, something I wouldn't have done some years ago, it's probably because growing old, I am more of a child than when I was younger. So I say, well, now perhaps I might run the risk of saying something confidential in front of such an audience. So the calculation, if there is a calculation, and obviously there is a calculation, despite the uncalculable hopelessness that I mentioned earlier, there is a calculation. That calculation, if I wanted to describe it briefly, would take the following form. I know that praying in that way, even if there is no one God in the form of a father or mother or receiving my prayer, I know that by this act of praying in the desert, out of love, because I wouldn't pray otherwise, something might be already good in myself, like a therapy in some way. I know that by doing this, I try, not necessarily succeed, but I try to affirm and to accept something in myself, which won't do any harm to anyone, especially to me. The impression that I do something good to myself, that's the calculation, and by the same token, to my beloved ones. If through this prayer I am a little better and reconciled, and if I give up any calculation, because of this calculation about around the incalculable, I can become better for myself, narcissistically, but to become better narcissistically is a way of loving in a better way, of being more lovable for our beloved ones. So that's a calculation. It's a calculation which tries to integrate the incalculable. And this, when I pray, it's a mixture of all these in the same instant, the same words or same gestures. I experience a sort of strange experience in which the Judaism of my childhood, my experience as a philosopher, as a quasi-theologian, all the texts I've read from Plato to St. Augustine to Heidegger to some they are there. They constitute my world, the world in which my prayers praise. Okay, and that's the way I pray. Sometimes in a given and let's say fixed moment in the day. Sometimes anywhere at any moment. For instance, now. I should stop.
I'd like to begin with a general question about the relations between deconstruction and Christianity. You pointed out that deconstruction is not to be regarded as a set of theses that can be simply removed from the contexts in which you write and applied to other contexts. It has neither a thetic character nor a proper home. Rather, deconstruction exists in its applications. It's forever mobile, reformulating itself in quite different places and times. In your early work, you came to deconstruction by way of particular philosophical and literary contexts. But as you know, deconstruction also has a rich Judeo-Christian heritage. One could see Heidegger's destruction of metaphysics as a folding of Luther's Heidelberg Disputation, which itself folds St. Paul's warning to the Corinthians, which has itself already folded Isaiah's vision of Yahweh's sentence, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise. I'm not suggesting that deconstruction can be translated without remainder by Heidegger's destruction, or that destruction can be translated without remainder by Luther's Destruntur. Rather, I'm drawing attention to a Judeo-Christian heritage of deconstruction. If this heritage exists and has effects, wouldn't a deconstruction of Christianity be bound to meet an internal limit? I'm thinking of Jean-Luc Nancy's project, needless to say, but more generally of movements of deconstruction already in Christianity, beginning with the formation of the canon and the writings of the Church Fathers. What sort of negotiations do you see as significant in that encounter?
Thank you, Kevin. Well, the word negotiations is a very difficult one here, because this negotiation, if there is such a thing, it shouldn't be a compromise. It should be a very very risky movement. But of course, and I would totally agree with you, there is a Christian heritage, a Judeo-Christian heritage. And since you mentioned Jean-Luc Nancy's project, Jean-Luc Nancy is, I know that not everyone in this room knows the context in which, in France, I've been working during the last years. Jean-Luc Nancy is one of my best friends, who is currently in France, who is currently writing or trying to write what he calls a book on deconstruction of Christianity. And already in the preface that he gave to this book, he agrees that Christianity is already self-deconstructed, so that the deconstruction of Christianity might be, in a certain way, the achievement of Christianity. And this could be true in many ways, not only because of the tradition that you recalled, Heidegger's Destruction, implying, without being reducible to it, implying Luther's project of Destruction, and so on and so forth, but also because, and of course the way I try and practice deconstruction would be an attempt to, on the one hand, think, understand this tradition with its differences, the internal differences, and its breaks, because Heidegger cannot be reduced to Luther, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, while I try to understand and to assume and to accept in a certain way this tradition, I would try to do something else. That is what I call deconstruction. I have a secret hope that it affects this tradition, not by betraying it, not by simply deforming it, but in a certain way affects this tradition in a unexpected, in a new way. Now, this other way, I could give you a number of signs of the fact that what I'm doing is not Heideggerian, as you know, is not Lutheran either. But this doesn't mean, and I think I would agree with you on that point, this doesn't mean that it's totally foreign to Jewish, Christian, or even Islamic possibility. Now, if this type of deconstruction that I try remains, let's say, Abrahamic, Jewish, Christian, Islamic, or whatever else, this would imply that it's part of this tradition, it's the memory of this tradition, but also that it affects this tradition in a way which is unpredictable. That is, what is Christianity and what is Judaism? Who knows? Who knows what it will be in the future? Okay? So, assuming that the new Christians or the new Jews or the new Muslims, assuming that they will have practiced this unpredictable new form of deconstruction, what are the criteria to say, well, this new form is Christian, I recognize it as Christian? My assumption is that Christianity, since here Christianity is more present, I understand, than other religions, but and the fact that the word deconstruction, that's why I think we should relate more to Christianity than to Judaism and Islam, because the word deconstruction, referring to Heidegger Destruction and to Luther Destruuntur, is more linked to Christianity than to Judaism and Islam. I mean, literally. But the fact that it is linked literally to Christianity doesn't mean that it is more, that Christianity is more deconstructive than other religions. Because I can imagine Jewish theologians, or Muslim theologians, or Buddhist, I have this experience, people coming from Far Eastern cultures tell me, well, deconstruction, we know that, we've known that for centuries. Okay? We've done nothing new. And I'm sure that there are Jewish theologians and Talmudists and probably Muslim theologians who would say the same. So the fact that the link to Christianity is more obvious, more apparent, more literal than the link to other religions doesn't mean that Christianity is has more affinity with deconstruction than any other culture or religion. Now, if what remains for me at least, and especially in what is currently happening in the world, what Christianity will become in the coming centuries is totally unpredictable. And perhaps it's the religion, if I can use this word, which is more prepared, more apt to transform itself than any other. When I spoke of mondialatinisation, that is the globalization as a Christianization, as a Roman Christianization, I implied that Christianity is the most plastic, the most open religion, that is the most prepared, better prepared to unpredictable transformations. That is, at the same time, the strongest and the more flexible to the event, to what is coming, to a new unpredictable form. So perhaps, in that case, if the Christian deconstruction develops, one day, at the same time, we won't recognize the Christian roots of Christian religion, and nevertheless be able to say, well, it is still Christian. And I think that what is happening today, and especially in places like this, is at least the obscure feeling that something is happening to Christianity, which is an unpredictable earthquake. Not necessarily a negative one, but unpredictable earthquake. Okay. So.
I've got a question for Reb Reader, as you've called yourself. Although you've never invoked the Jewish tradition in any rooted or direct way, I think there are many resonances between your work and the Midrashim. For example, when you ask in The Gift of Death whether the story of the sacrifice of Isaac is predicated on the sacrifice of woman in both active and passive senses, woman as object and subject of sacrifice, I think of the ancient Midrashim that see the death of Sarah in Genesis 23 as a consequence of Genesis 22. I'm interested to hear how you might read a couple of Midrashic fragments from Genesis Rabbah, which treat, as you do, subjects of blood, sacrifice, love, circumcision, and woman, and that in fact seem to read the sacrifice of Isaac as a hyper-circumcision. The first fragment is a commentary on God's rather overqualified command to Abraham, take your son, your only son, whom you love, even Isaac. And it goes like this. God said, take your son. Abraham said to him, I have 2 sons. He said to him, "Your only one." He said, "This one is the only son to his mother, and this one is the only one to his mother." He said to him, "Whom you love?" He said, "I love them both." He said to him, "Isaac." And the second fragment stages a drama that precedes the sacrifice. And it goes like this. Isaac and Ishmael were engaged in controversy. The latter argued, "I'm more beloved than you because I was circumcised at the age of 13, while the other retorted, "I'm more beloved than you because I was circumcised at 8 days. Ishmael said to him, "I'm more beloved than you since I was circumcised at 13 and could have protested, but you were circumcised as a baby and could not refuse." At that moment, Isaac exclaimed, "Oh, that God would appear to me and bid me cut off my limbs, then I would not refuse." Another version says Isaac retorted, "All that you did was lend to the Holy One, blessed be He, 3 drops of blood. But I'm now 37 years old, yet if God desired of me that I be slaughtered, I would not refuse."
Thank you. Perhaps at the end of my two answers, I'll try to relate the two commentaries. The first one, I would say, that's I improvise an hypothesis. The first one tells us about the terrible experience of, let's say, facing God, obeying God, who gives unjustifiable orders in the name of love, the one you love, and asks someone, in this case Abraham, to choose between 2 equally beloved sons. Abraham says, "I love them equally. Both are the sons of their mother, of his mother, and I love them equally." And God insists, "You only one. So you have to elect one." So then Abraham insists, "I love both." And he said, "I love them both." And God said, "Isaac, just one." It's a terrible situation. Long before the experience of the what one calls sacrifice, not a sacrifice, but even before going up to the Mount Moriah. It's terrible when we have to choose between 2 equally beloved ones. That's a terrible experience we experience every day. So what Abraham experiences at that moment is that he has to blindly obey an order, an heteronomic order, for which no justification can be provided. No intelligible justification. Okay? So immediately this situation goes beyond, let's say, any ethical, any human level. It's not. That's what Kierkegaard says. In fact, Abraham remains a criminal. On the level of ethics, it's a crime. And when Abraham accepts that God, in a way which is totally asymmetrical, says, "Well, I elect you in order that you elect one of your sons, and you elect him as the one who you love. I suppose you love him more than the other, in order to kill him." So here we have the experience of this terrible law of the duty, that is to act out of duty to act while obeying God, you must give up any justification, any human intelligible justification. You have to give up any knowledge. So the leap, what one calls the leap of Abraham, is a leap beyond knowledge, beyond ethics, beyond social bonds, beyond love, out of love, because God says, the one you love. So that's the absolute religious experience, if there is such a thing. The pure act of faith, the asymmetrical obedience to an absurd order, an unintelligible order, beyond ethics, knowledge, and so on and so forth. Now, the second commentary has to do with two ways of understanding circumcision. On the one hand, Isaac, who has been circumcised before having to accept circumcision, before having to understand. That's what happens in Jewish religion. So 7 days, that is, it's a covenant which is signed and to which one has to subscribe before understanding anything, before opening one's eyes, before speaking. So, as opposed to this, the Ishmael in Muslim culture said, well, at least I was old enough to understand, that is, to transform the heteronomy into an autonomy. I was freely accepting circumcision. So my faith is more intelligible, more authentic than yours, because in a certain with Ishmael's answer in this, at least in the logic of this commentary, we have already the beginning of I would call this, to save time, secularization. That is a way of transforming heteronomy, this asymmetrical situation in which the baby, the young boy, is circumcised before understanding, before speaking. He is inscribed in the community before having anything to know and to think and to see and to say. So Ishmael is trying to transform this asymmetrical covenant into a somewhat symmetrical, autonomous contract. And that's the beginning of secularization, the transition from heteronomy to some autonomy. But at the same time, what Ishmael claims is that since he is prepared to make this sacrifice at an age when one understands, he is more, let's say, ready to enter the covenant, which remains asymmetrical. So there is this of course, this competition. But the other version that you mentioned, another version says, Isaac retorted, all that you did was to lend the Holy One, blessed be He, 3 drops of blood, that is circumcision, 3 drops of blood, even if you are 13. But I'm now 37 years old, yet if God desired of me that I be slaughtered, I would not refuse. So there is this auction, in a certain way, between the two. Now, of course, I was circumcised when I was 7 days without understanding anything, but now if God demands or asks me to do even more, to be slaughtered, now as an adult I would accept. So there is this auction, wanting to be more obedient and more submitted, more subjected to God in an asymmetrical way than the other. And of course, it is difficult to read this commentary without having one's eyes in the direction of what's happening today in many parts of the world, in Jerusalem among others, in this war about who has been more true to God, more subject to heteronomy in a certain way, that is, more of a believer. That if I had time, I would go in that direction, in the political direction. But when I say political, and there's a lot to be said about politics and Judaism and Islam and Christianity today, needless to say. But when I say political, I point to this level, this human level, which has been exceeded by the very first moment in this history, when Abraham is given the order. It's no more. We have no more to do with ethics, politics, and law and legal, and the law in the sense of legal, if not justice. So how are we to translate this meta-political, trans-political situation into the politics of our time? That's what politics are about today. How can we translate this reference, this Abrahamic reference, Ibrahimic reference to this situation and into the political, the geopolitical situation today? It's a matter of translation, not only of a commentary on these commentaries, but how are we to translate this non-political, non-ethical, or trans-ethical, trans-political situation into the political responsibilities which are ours today. Matter of negotiations, again, in the most risky negotiations. But the fact is that if one wants to be rigorous in this negotiation, we have to, at the same time, keep in mind the specificity of ethics and politics and the irreducible specificity of this trans-political and trans-ethical situation. So on the one hand, you have, let's say, Kierkegaard insisting on the trans-ethical stage, the religious level, and on the other hand, someone like Levinas, who says, well, in fact, in this situation, that's where Levinas opposes Kierkegaard. In that situation, what is most important is not the fact that Abraham was ready to sacrifice, as one says, in a wrong way, to sacrifice. The most interesting point is the angel who spends the sacrifice. That in fact, this unethical situation, the murder, because it's a murder. Kierkegaard says it's a murder. We have to keep in mind that Abraham was a murderer, was a criminal in terms of ethics. For Levinas, well, what matters here is not the fact that Abraham was ready to kill his son, but the fact that God interrupted the slaughter.
My first question had to do with prayer, and my second question has to do with God. So I want to ask you not so much about God, but about the name of God, and how the name of God operates in your texts. As I understand deconstruction is always an affirmation. It arises from and leads up to an affirmation. Now, I would say, I mean, perhaps you would want to argue about this, but I would say that in the earlier writings of grammatology and through the 70s, when you tended to use the name of God, that tended to be, you tended to use that to refer to it in terms of theological closure. It was, the name functioned as a way to arrest the play, or as a desire for a centered discourse, a transcendental signifier. But in the later writings, I have the sense that the the emphasis has changed somewhat, and that the name of God has become a more open-ended name for you, more affirmative. And maybe we could say not so much a theological name as a religious name, and one that, for example, in Sophlonome, you even speak of saving. So, whether you're mentioning the name of God or using the name of God, and it would be interesting to know which is which and when you're doing which, and I'm not sure. But whether you're mentioning it or using it, what is going on with this name?
Thank you, John. A difficult question because, on the one hand, it's true that there has been a change, not, let's say, in my way of addressing these questions, but in the strategy of the text. It is true that at the time of what you call the earlier writings, I was speaking in a context in which the name of God was more, let's say, inscribed in what Heidegger would call ontotheological. God as the absolute being, that is being present, and so on and so forth, and playing in the system of, let's say, ontology, ontotheology, a certain role. So at that point, of course, when I said theological, I meant what you said. And even today, when I speak of sovereignty as an ontotheological phantasm or heritage, I have the same name of God in mind. But even then, at the time of grammatology, I had and there must be signs of it in these early texts, the feeling that the name of God doesn't function the way one usually thinks it functions. That is, and Hegel already said this, there is no example. God cannot be an example. The name of God is not a name among others. It must function differently. And to come to your distinction, to the distinction between mention and use, and we say whether you are mentioning this name or using it, and you add often. No, I'm often not sure when you are doing the one or the other. I'm not sure either, because if there is something unique in the name of God, in what it names, and in the way we name through it, there is something unique. That is, the distinction between mentioning and using is not pertinent anymore. If you want this distinction to work, you have to at least imply that when you use a word, there is a referent. I say, give me a glass, okay? When I mention the word glass, I mention the word, okay? I'm referring to a word, I'm not referring to a thing. Okay? Now, God, given precisely this deconstructive move, God is not the omnipotent first cause, prime mover, absolute being, absolute presence. So God is not something or someone being, some being that I could refer to by using the word God. The word God has an essential link to the possibility of being named. On the one hand, it's far beyond any given existence. It's transcendent any given form of being. So I cannot use the word God the way I use it for any finite being, on the one hand. And on the other hand, since God has an essential, it is assumed that the word God, that God, thus named as an essential link to being named, being called, being addressed. So when I use the word God, I mention it. It's a word that I received as a word with no visible, experienced reference. So this comes back to what I said about the prayer. When I pray, if I say God, if I address God, I don't know if I'm using the word God or mentioning the word God. And it is this impossibility or the limit of the pertinence of this distinction between mention and use, which makes religion possible, which makes God possible, which makes, let's say, the reference to God possible, the reference in terms of use or mention. So that's why in a number of texts which are more recent, I was attentive to precisely through texts around Angelus Silesius and others to the name of God. The question is the name of God. And when I say the name of God, it's not a nominalistic suspicion. What are we doing when we name God? And what are the limits of this naming? Now, we know that in many precisely Abrahamic traditions, God is nameless, is what is beyond the name. In Jewish tradition, God is the empty place and beyond any name. But we name the nameless. We name what is nameless. And when we name what is quote unquote, what is not. What is or is not nameless, what do we do? And that's why being a believer, even a mystic believer, and being an atheistic person is not necessarily different. And I know that the most authentic believers know that they are very close to pure atheism, because they know that using the word God, they may be simply mentioning it, and that to mention the word of God in a certain way is already an act of faith. The faith consists in, if there is a pure faith, I'm not sure, but if there is a pure faith, it consists in asking the question, when I use the word God, am I referring to someone or mentioning a name? Mentioning a name. Not in the way grammarians or literary critics mention or quote. It's not a quote, but I may simply use the word as a word. But a word is not nothing. Naming, calling. I think Heidegger makes this interesting distinction between, let's say, nennen, to name, and heißen, and calling. When I mention the name of God, do I give a name, or do I call? Now, it's difficult to think the experience of naming without referring to the experience of calling. To name is to call. Now, if I am calling God, what I'm doing, what is it to call? Some, on the one hand, some non-believers will say, well, you're just calling. That's you're mentioning a name, just calling, that's a call. Others would say, well, the fact that I call is already not a proof, but a sign that God is the one who makes me call God. Okay? And the two say different things, but the same thing. The one say, well, when you name God, you call God. Well, that's you call. That's a call. You mention the word call. It's an empty call. Okay? And the other would say, well, if I feel the move, the motivation, the impulse to call God, it means that God is called through me. Okay? That there is something in me which calls God, and this is my faith. And the fact that the other says, the skeptical one says, well, it's just let's say nominalistic experience of calling. It's just part of my faith, because if when I call, I was sure that there is someone, some real one at the other end, I wouldn't call. Okay? That's why the skeptical is part of the faithful one. If God was really present and as a sure and ensured presence, I wouldn't call, and I wouldn't call anyone. I wouldn't call even Kevin, who is close to me, if I was sure that Kevin is really absolutely present to me. When I call him, it's because in a certain way he's not sure that he's just paying attention to me or simply present. Okay? So that's why between the skeptical one, the skeptic, and the faith, the believer, there is no mere contradiction. And that's what happens with this unique name of God. It doesn't mean, and just one postscriptum, doesn't mean that the name of God is unique in that respect. Because what I just said about the uniqueness of the name of God can be translated or transposed into, or translated into any name of anyone. The name of anyone, even any finite being, it's the same situation. That's why I took the example of Kevin. It's the same structure. The same structure. And that's why what I call here faith is at the same time an exceptional, unique experience and something very, very common and very let's say universal in a certain way.
I asked before, Jacques, a question about the relations between deconstruction and Christianity, and I'd like to ask a question now about the relations between theology and deconstruction. It seems to me that theology is not just one humanities discipline among others. The theologian speaks and writes from within the sphere of faith, or perhaps more exactly, from within an intersection of the spheres of faith and reason. Although you've discussed various topics in mysticism and apophatic theology, and you've brooded on sacrifice and the two sources of religion, you've never written as a theologian. You've written about faith, about religious faith rather than theological faith, if I might borrow Thomas Aquinas' distinction. And I'd like to ask you a question about faith. Does deconstruction in theology meet an internal limit? If someone has theological faith, that's to say in the Christian tradition, confesses to a belief in Jesus as the Christ, does that limit what deconstruction can do in that person's thought? Or does it offer another context in which deconstruction works, albeit differently than in other contexts?
Thank you. understand, you'll tell me if I understand you correctly, that what you call theological faith as opposed to religious faith implies the reference to an historical event, that is Jesus. If someone, you say, has theological faith, confesses to believe in Jesus as the Christ, does that limit what the deconstruction can do in that person's thought? That is, what you call theology here is a way of relying on revelation, whereas religious faith is something more universal? Or?
Theological faith is that which arises from grace given by God.
Mm-hmm. Well, about grace given by God, deconstruction as such has nothing to say or to do. If it's given, let's say, to someone in a way which is absolutely improbable, that is exceeding any proof, in a unique experience, then deconstruction has no lever on this, and should not have any lever. But once this grace, this given grace, is embodied in a discourse, in a community, in a church, in a religion, in a theology. That's why the word theological is a little troubling to me. When it is embodied in a body of discourses, institutions, and so on and so forth, then some deconstruction may have something to say, something to do, without let's say, questioning or suspecting the moment of grace, but about the consequences, the discourses, the institutions, the authority, the law, the politics, which might be the consequences of this grace. Yes, deconstruction has something to do, while respecting the possibility of this grace. But the possibility of this grace is not accessible. It's not publicly accessible. And on that point of view, I'm really Kierkegaardian. The experience of faith is something which exceeds language in a certain way, ethics, politics, society, and not in front, because we're never in front of this, but in relation to this experience of faith, deconstruction is totally useless and disarmed. And perhaps it's not simply the weak part of deconstruction. It's perhaps because deconstruction starts from this possibility of, if not the given grace, but this absolutely secret experience, which I would compare to what you call grace. That's perhaps the starting point of any deconstruction. That's why deconstruction is totally disarmed, totally useless when it reaches that point.
Back in 1995, John Caputo, as a faithful secretary or extra scriver, wrote a commentary on the gift of death. And this is how he translated your passage about what would happen if Abraham were to sacrifice on the top of Montmartre instead of on Moriah in Jerusalem, in the incendiary Middle East, where we expect such things to happen. He wrote this: "Were a man later this week to take his son and head up to the top of the World Trade Center with the intention of offering his son in sacrifice, we would send a SWAT team to seize the man and put him under arrest for attempted murder for denying the most elemental command of ethics, which is not to deal in death." 7 years ago, John's translation was comically illustrative, and now it makes us tremble in ways we could never have anticipated. My question is, How should we read yours and John's glosses on De Silentio and a certain Abraham or Ibrahim at home in Europe and America after what we now call 9/11, after the World Trade Center collapsed under the impact of knife and fire, murdering over 3,000 sons and daughters, and after Mohammed Atta, hijacker of American Airlines Flight 11, left a note saying that his parents should be like Ibrahim, who willingly offered up their son to death?
It's a very, very dangerous question. I admire that Jack in 95 already took the example of the World Trade Center, replacing my reference to Montmartre, very peaceful Montmartre, replacing it by the WTC. Although already in 95, and I don't say this to ignore your merit, in 95 already there had been bombing in the World Trade Center. And the World Trade Center is, of course, the mountain, the highest point in this country, in a certain way. Now, before is the Tower of Babel, in a certain way. Not the Mount Moriah, but the Tower of Babel, which, as you remember, has been destroyed by God, in a certain way, because of the arrogance of the people who built the Tower of Babel. Of course, we could take a number of other examples today of, let's say, terrible sacrifices or terrible murders, collective murders coming from above through a number of planes, bombing, and etc. etc. I won't give other examples, but simply I would like to signal that there might be a number of other examples of this situation today. Now, Yvonne's question is, how should we read yours and Jacques' glosses on De Silentio and a certain Ibrahim at home in Europe and America after 9/11, and so on and so forth? And after Mohammed Atta, hijacker of American Airlines Flight 11, left a note saying that his parents should be like Ibrahim, who willingly offered up their son to death. First, the comparison stops very quickly, because even if the parents of Mohammed Atta were ready to offer their sons, in the case of Abraham and Isaac, there was no collective murder. There was just a victim, or someone sacrificed. Whereas in that case, he didn't simply commit suicide. He killed thousands of people by the same. So does that mean that the comparison doesn't work at all? If we seriously address the question of the political, military, historical consequences of the sacrifice of Isaac in the world since that time, in the name of these traditions, millions of people have been killed, and are still being killed. So I don't know what the interpretation might be. My first reaction would be, in any case, whether one considers the suicidal aspect or the murders, the collective murders, the consequences of this reference to the divine order is on the side of death. And I cannot see any justification whatsoever for killing. Even if I use the example, the remarkable exemplary example of Abraham and Isaac, to say, and that's what Jack was commenting upon, to say that each time we have to make a choice, we are in this situation. Okay? Even if I use this example as paradigmatic, I would not draw the consequence that the choice of, let's say, killing, a choice against life, might be justifiable in any way. Abraham remains a criminal on earth from the point of view of what one calls life. Abraham remains a criminal, and Muhammad Atta also. Okay? And a suicide bomber is a criminal to one who kills himself first and kills a number of people. Okay? So from that point of view, I could find no justification whatsoever in these languages. But as you know, crimes of war, crimes at war, are always, especially now, justified, allegedly justified by religious reasons. Even in Bush's discourse, when he speaks of the going at war against the axis of evil, God bless America, and so on and so forth, we have some fundamentalist religious justification, alleged justification. So I can find no justification whatsoever in this reference to a sacrifice. So my own, let's say, discourse would be simply against any justifiable, allegedly justified killing and suicide either. And I would, if I had to address this question politically today, I would multiply the examples, despite the terrible example that you choose, and despite all the compassion that we may have for the victims of this 9/11 crime, we would have to take other examples today and to evaluate politically what the situation is. Next.
Skip the four. Skip number 3. Back in October of 2001, when you were at Villanova, you made a remark about the powerlessness of God, which I found very interesting and fascinating. And I wonder if we can talk a little bit about that. What you said was, God is supposed to be absolutely powerful in our tradition, and that you are trying to think of some divinity dissociated from power, if that is possible. And then you added, because a lot of people would say this, you added that there is in Jesus Christ some weakness, some vulnerability, some powerlessness, but that for you, this powerlessness, of course, is also a sign of the Almighty. And then you concluded this would have heavy ethical and political consequences, and it would deserve a much longer answer. So maybe we can take a moment to add something to that now and talk a little bit about what you meant by the powerlessness of God, and it's a counterintuitive idea in some ways, that to dissociate God from power goes against the very idea of God as omnipotent, as a fundamental classical conception of God. So in what sense could God lack power and still be God? And what would motivate you to talk about God in terms of powerlessness?
Thank you. Well, on the one hand, there is nothing absolutely original in saying that there might be some, not absolute powerlessness, but some powerlessness in God. Even if one considers God as infinite, we know through the Bible, for instance, that there are moments in Genesis or in which God, I wouldn't say repents, because there is a problem of translation here, but God realizes that He has not done something which couldn't be improved. So there is some finitude in God's infinity. Then in Hegel, you could understand that despite God's infinity, God goes out of itself or himself and in nature and becomes finite, and to that extent limited in his power. And there are a number of examples of such a tradition. But this is not the way and of course Jesus Christ's vulnerability or weakness. But this is not the way I approach this possibility of a powerless God. My starting point had to do with the problem of sovereignty. And I tried again and again to dissociate two concepts which are usually indissociable. That is the unconditionality and sovereignty. Indivisibility, unconditionality, and sovereignty. And I would like to think of something unconditional in forgiving, in the grace, in forgiveness, in the gift, in hospitality, some unconditionality which wouldn't be a sign of power, a sign of sovereignty. So I try to dissociate sovereignty and unconditionality. And if I think of God on the side of, let's say, grace, forgiveness, hospitality, unconditionality, unconditional law, then in order to not to have to agree with what I call the ontotheological tradition of sovereignty, one has to dissociate God's sovereignty from God, from the idea of a God. God without sovereignty, God without omnipotence, God without absolute power. And if one thinks of this possibility of the name of God being dissociated from the absolute power, then this would be a strategical and political lever to think of unconditionality without sovereignty, and to deconstruct the politics of the political concept of sovereignty today, which is, I would argue, which is a heritage of ontotheology. The history of the concept of sovereignty, which is today, of course, let's say, undergoing a terrible crisis, with an earthquake all over the world, with nation states trying to keep the sovereignty and others trying to challenge this sovereignty. So today, the political problems in international law are problems of sovereignty. So, and we have to think differently about sovereignty and to deconstruct the tradition, the ontotheological tradition of sovereignty. And from that point of view, if we want to keep what I call the unconditional, the reference to the unconditionality in gift, in hospitality, in forgiveness, and so on. So we have to dissociate sovereignty and unconditionality, and then to dissociate what one calls God and absolute power. And perhaps this comes close to some Christian motive, the one you just mentioned. Then we would have to rethink the vulnerability and powerlessness of Jesus without the absolute power, which nevertheless remains in the tradition the foundation of, let's say, the last recourse of this Christianity. If it's as weak and vulnerable that Jesus Christ represents, so to speak, or incarnates God, then the consequence would be that God has some powerlessness, or the other way around, that in fact the weakness, the powerlessness of Jesus is the human part of the passion, whereas God remains absolute power. That's a choice or a decision which has to be made within Christianity. Another experience of another Christian experience. I think. Tell me if you agree that there are the two movements in Christianity.
Yeah, and you're suggesting the more radical possibility. I mean, the more traditional one would be to say that there is a vulnerability in Jesus, but God retains God's absolute power. But to say that there's a vulnerability in God and a genuine powerlessness in God, and that Jesus incarnates that, it is more interesting.
More interesting, but less common, no?
I think so.
Yeah.
From time to time, Jacques, you've made use of Heidegger's distinction between revelation and revealability, Offenbarung, Offenbarkeit. As usually received, the distinction asks us to think about the relative priority of revelation and revealability. Does revelation precede revealability, making conditions of manifestation apparent only after the fact? Or are conditions of revealability in place before revelation occurs? I'd like to invite you to reflect on the distinction. Is it a clear alternative, or should it be understood, as you hint now and again, as an aporia? You suggested in Politics of Friendship that rethinking the alternative by way of iterability might, and I quote from you, might at least give access to a structure of experience in which the two poles of the alternative cease to oppose one another to form another node, another logic, another chronology, another history, another relation to the order of orders. And I'd like to ask you if you could say a little more about this other structure of experience.
Thank you. In fact, what I could say would simply go along with what you just suggested. It's an aporia, and as you know, the aporia for me doesn't mean simply a paralysis, no way. It's on the contrary the condition of proceeding, of making a decision, of going forward. The aporia